Okay, good evening and welcome everyone to the September 29th work session. We're going to go ahead and get started and we'll just call the meeting to order. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the mic over to Superintendent Cordy to start us off.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair Hecker. So this evening, the primary focus of our work session is to provide a school funding overview. And this is in direct response to the conversations that we had and the work that we did on August 24th when we had facilitator Peg Portscheller with us. And she conducted an activity that really delved into the needs that staff have of the board and the board has of staff. And one of the things that we heard from the board is the desire to have opportunities to really, again, delve deeply into subjects to really learn the history and to get caught up, especially for our newest board members, but also as a good review for all of us. And so this is the first in that series. And so this will be everything that we thought was important for an initial conversation about school funding and an overview. It is, as a reminder, a work session, so please be sure to interject with questions along the way. We took great care in creating this slide deck and this presentation to not make any assumptions about definitions being known. And so you'll see that the slides are very text heavy to really help with that part of the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Rose, our Chief Operations Officer.
Thank you, Superintendent Cordy, Chair Hecker, members of the board. I appreciate your time this evening. Tonight, we're going to have a bit of a primer on school funding and associated topics. This is really the big picture and not intended to be specifically about our budget process. That will come during the budget committee orientation, which typically happens in late winter, early spring, followed by our budget process, which happens in that April, May, June timeframe as well. So we'll have more specifics about our budgeting at that time. So tonight, if I can get my thing to advance. There we go. Whoops. All right, sorry, slow down there. Tonight, we're going to talk about the state school fund and formula resources. ADM, which is short for average daily membership and the variations of that and what that means to us. We're going to discuss enrollment, grants, spend a little bit of time on the 2016 capital improvement bond, and then a little bit on transportation as well. The state school fund is really how we get our money. It's often abbreviated to SSF, so you may see that in communications. And it's the primary funding mechanism for public schools across the state. Measures 5 and Measures 50 passed in the early 90s. Both set limits on property tax rates and assessed values, and they required the state to make up lost property tax or lost property taxes to schools. And so that really took, particularly Measure 5, took the state funding system of education from a state assisted system to a state supported system. So instead of the state adding some dollars to each school district's budget, it really became the state providing the bulk of the money for all school districts. It also, in doing so, created a situation where we, as a state, needed to have equitable funding across districts. And that's really where the state school fund comes into play. And the state school fund is designed to provide a fair way to distribute state education dollars regardless of location. The system is requirements based. And so we must follow certain requirements. The Ready School Safe Learners is one of those. Last spring, if we didn't follow it, we didn't get our funding. And you may recall early in the pandemic, we were required as a school district to maintain our level of FTE, our level of staff at the time, to continue getting funding. So that was that spring of 2020. That was one of the requirements that was given to us. In terms of the components of the state school fund, there is state revenue, which is really our income taxes, a little bit of lottery proceeds, and it's the largest part of the overall state budget. Local revenue includes property taxes levied by the school district. And again, it's limited, as I mentioned, by Measure 5. And then the total of the state school fund and local revenue is what we call the formula resources, which are distributed across all districts. And we'll get to the mechanics of that in just a moment. Disbursements are funds for specific programs. Whoops, I'm jumping ahead too fast here. Or funds that are going to specific purposes like carve-outs, which include items like long-term care, long-term care and treatment, Oregon School for the Deaf, and then sub-grants, which includes transportation, facility grants, high-cost disability grants, those types of items. For the elements of our particular budget, we get about 63% from the state. We get 30% from the property taxes that are collected within our district boundaries. And then the balance is 7%. And that is really, it's facility grants, or excuse me, facility rental, transportation fees, and indirects charged to grants. So an indirect is a fee we're allowed to charge against grants that allows us to cover those costs that are not direct to the grant. My example might be for a grant where we need to hire a staff member. The indirect is really there to allow us to cover the cost of HR facilitating that hire. And so rather than build into the grant an HR fee, it comes out of that indirect. The indirect amount is the percentage is set by ODE, the Department of Education, for us annually. So it's a mechanism that allows us to take portions of grants and fund those kind of core operations of the district.
Jim?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you're going to get to this or not, but I think it's useful to maybe at this stage, if you aren't getting to it later, to talk about the property tax component, because we pay pretty substantial property taxes here in this district that are both bond related and then just an overall general property tax. Whereas if you were to go to, say, a district on the South Coast, they pay less than $1 in kind of general fund property taxes for schools, whereas we're paying closer to $4. Can you talk a little bit about how the state treats those differences in property taxes with respect to the state school fund and the distribution, and how equalization works a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to cover property taxes a bit more in a couple of slides.
Perfect.
So if
Thank
I
you.
may cover that
Yep.
and then answer any specific questions at that time, I'd appreciate it.
Perfect.
Thank you. Excuse me. There are different ways in which you will hear about state school funding as we go kind of through the budget process and as the legislature meets. And a couple of the terminology pieces I want you to be familiar with is current service level. And so this is really, what is it going to cost either for our district or for the state system of education as a whole to keep the programs we have today operating in the next biennium? So no growth, no additional programs, those kinds of things, but just what does it cost to run programs in the next biennium, given that you have inflationary costs, you have roll-up costs for contracts, those kinds of things. We also will likely talk about the governor's recommended budget. This typically comes out in December prior to a full legislative session. And this is, to some extent, the governor's, it's what they plan, what they hope our legislature will pass. And it is, again, the starting point for the legislature to work from. And then as the legislative session gets started, the Joint Ways and Means Committee co-chairs create a budget picture of their own, and that becomes kind of the working document that the legislature advances, and that becomes bills. It's usually provided early in the legislative session, although that has varied the last 3 or 4 sessions as well. And then finally, we end with the legislatively approved appropriations. And this is essentially the state adopted budget. It's a number of different bills, one of which will be about the state school fund and the amount in it. So speaking of property taxes, therefore our operations, and I want to draw the distinction between a school district and other municipalities, meaning the city of Sherwood, Washington County, any of your other kind of public agencies that are funded by taxes. They're able to levy those taxes and they retain what they get within the district. And that's why they often have conversations about, well, do we have the right balance of residential versus commercial real estate and those zones throughout the district. They're also able to levy fines and fees for speeding or for building permits, those kinds of things. Whereas with the school district, we collect these dollars, but they become part of the overall state school fund pot. And so if we collect more, that means we get less from the state, where it gets equalized across all districts. So it's this kind of, there's one big bucket, and how much we put into it, to some extent, doesn't matter. We're going to get our portion out of the bucket at the end of the day. And so we do pay more here in Sherwood, and those dollars mean that, you know, that was back to that 30%. We pay basically 30% of our own revenue is coming from our local property taxes, where a South Coast district, it may only be 10% is coming from their local, and the rest is coming from the state. So that balances across the state in various ways. In some districts, you'll have them collecting more property taxes than they receive from the state school fund. And others like ours, we're getting more from the state school fund. So it just varies depending on what the local kind of conditions and tax receipts are from. In addition to these levied taxes that help support our operations through the state school fund, our local community can and has passed taxes to support a general obligation bond. So that's our 2016 capital improvement bond. And those dollars are specific to what's written into the original bond language. And so we don't have a lot of options beyond what's there in how we don't have options beyond what's there in how we spend those dollars. And I'm going to come back to the bond in a little bit and explain that a little further, but they're very limited as to how we can spend them. So here's kind of a different visual on how the state school fund is, what that formula looks like. So you have the state school fund allocation. This is the amount that the state legislature has set aside and said, we're putting this amount in. You add in those property taxes and local revenues, and that gives you the state available resources. They take the carve outs, they take the transportation grant, and then the balance is what is distributed by ADM. And I'll talk about ADM in another slide here just a moment and explain further what each of those pieces are. But two other pieces that are kind of important to know about: the common school fund revenue. And so this is revenue from school lands and their mineral resources that were placed in trust when Oregon was admitted to the Union. So these go way back. And then it's any unclaimed property in the state, and those are invested, and a portion of the investment proceeds are distributed to schools. There's also the county school fund revenue, and this is in state statute, and it required each county to create a county school fund for the receipt of federal forest revenue. Now, we don't have a lot of forest in Washington County, and so we're not getting a large portion of this, but that's why some parts of our state, their local revenue is quite high because they do receive some of these funds. And then just to give you a couple of ideas on what the carve-outs are. So those are monies directed to TAG, speech pathology, Oregon Virtual School District, small high schools, skilled nursing facilities, and then high-cost disabilities. And then the transportation grant, which I'll cover a bit more later as well, is to reimburse districts for school buses. So this is one of those acronyms you're going to hear a lot of in various ways, and they're all variations of average daily membership. So when you hear ADM or ADMR, we're really talking about the number of students that are registered in the district. So you can kind of think of it as children in chairs. ADMW, which is average daily membership weighted, this is the number of registered students times a weighting for specific qualified categories. And the next slide will show you some of those weights. So I'll get to those in just a moment. And then ADME is one that isn't heard of quite as much, and it's a average daily membership extended. And this is really the higher of last year's or this year's ADM number. And it allows the state to provide funding based on that. And it helps districts when they have an enrollment drop. And so I'm going to give you an example of how it's actually really helped us in the last few years. In 2020, our ADM was 4,627. In the fall of 2020, as we approached the year, really, actually, it was winter of 2020, prior to the pandemic and right at the beginning of the pandemic, we went through quite a process to develop the enrollment number that we budgeted on, and we'd set a number of 5,018. The actual in the fall of 2020 was 4,627 kids, so quite a bit short of our projection. But because our previous year, the enrollment number was 5,020, we received our state funding on that 5,020, despite having 4,600 students roughly in the district. And so ADME is one of those things that really helps when you really need it. And if you're a district that's growing, which Sherwood had for quite a number of years, you didn't really worry too much about ADME because you had a pretty good assumption that you were going to be bigger the next fall. We ran into it this year with the pandemic in particular that caused our numbers to drop. And so we relied on ADME this past year. That one's pretty important. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions. We are going to talk about weights in just a moment.
Jim, can you talk about how and when ADMW and ADMR are set? Because that number doesn't get a shift all year long. So
Yes. And you are just ahead of me by 2 slides on every question. That's all right. So if you don't mind, I will pause for a moment because I have a slide that I think will help explain that. If I may, I'll continue though talking a little bit about ADMR and ADMW. So on the left, the chart shows some of the weights for students, and the weights per student cannot exceed 2.0. And so every student counts at least as 1. And then if they are on an IEP, they get another weight. Students in foster care get a weight. If they happen to go to remote elementary or a small high school, they get additional weights, but any particular student can't exceed 2.0. And then the listing on the right is actually, these are pre-pandemic numbers from a couple of years back. And as you can see, our relative weighting is less than all but one of our peer districts. And so our ADM in that particular year was 5,147. When you add in the weights for our students that qualified for that additional portion, it was 5,811. So our ADM as a percentage of ADMW as a percentage of ADM is basically 112.9%, whereas Portland is 118, Hillsborough is 120, and like Salem Kaiser there is 127%. And so what the effect on us compared to Salem Kaiser is that for every 4 students Salem Kaiser gets, they get funding for a 5th student. Whereas for every 8 students that we have, we get funding for an additional student. And so they are just getting quite a bit more per student than we are. When you add in local options and some of the other mechanisms they might have for funding, we just get funded in Sherwood at a lower rate than many of our peers across the region. So let's talk about some of the drivers of our revenue and cost. The revenue is really almost entirely driven by our enrollment. And we use estimates that we start in December of a preceding a budget year for budgeting purposes. And then we start reporting to ODE on October 1 of a budget year. And we revise that in May of a particular budget year. But the final revenue doesn't come for a full extra year. So let me go through what this is going to look like for this coming year. December of 2021, we're going to start estimating our number for the following year. So for July 1 of 2022. On October 1 of 2022, we'll report our first ADM number to the state. We'll revise that in May of 23. And then our final revenue number and the final amount that we get from the state will be shored up and shared with us in May of 2024. So our budget cycle, even though it's for one school year, extends well beyond that 1 year to basically exceed 2 full years of time between when we first start talking about what our revenue could be and when we find out what it actually is. I'll give it a minute to think, to let that settle in, because that's part of one of the challenges that all school districts have in funding is you can set it today, but because we don't know how many kids will show up, not only in our district, but in every other district across the state, it becomes very difficult to know what that final budget number is, that final revenue number is, until well past the school year actually being over.
And the problem is both, not only how many kids, but how many weights, because the pie is set. It's just a question of how you cut it up. And if more kids in more district qualify for weights, then the proportion of a district that may not have as many weights, that percentage keeps going down. And we have no control over that.
That is correct. So let's talk about the cost drivers for the cost drivers. The biggest portion of our budget is staffing at 85.5%. It's actually gone up a couple of, you may remember in the past, it's been around 83%. Phil has recently helped me determine the new number, and it's 85.5% of our cost is staffing. The remaining 14.5% is buildings, supplies, maintenance, and like our 30% share of transportation. Since enrollment and that projection is so important, let's talk about how we do this. We actually have 3 means of projecting enrollment. We start with Davis Demographics. This is a company that we started working with in the fall of 2015, and they specialize in just this work. They work with school districts determining how many kids are going to be within your boundaries in the future. They feel really confident with their numbers for 3 years. We actually have them do a 10-year projection. The further past that 3 years, they get less confident, but it's still really important to know, particularly as we're looking at capacity of buildings and capacity of the new high school, what does that 10-year projection look like? And so it makes a lot of sense to have them do that. And they make those projections in 3 ways. First, they start with birth rates, and they go back 5 years and look at the boundaries within our school district and determine how many babies were born. That gives us a good idea to start with on how many kindergartners we're going to have to show up in any particular fall. Then they look at the move in and move out rates. And so they divide our district up into over 100 little sections on the map, and they track each one and determine how many kids have moved in and how many kids have moved out. And then they make a projection on what that's going to do to our overall population. And then finally, they work with our city and our county, and not just city of Sherwood, but city of Wilsonville, city of Tualatin, all those that we actually touch on. And they talk to them about, okay, what are the planned developments going on in your community that have kind of reached that permit phase? And so they're looking at like Brookman Road. They know how many homes are expected to go into Brookman Road, and they start building in a factor for those homes and when those are expected to come online, because we know there's going to be nearly 1,000 homes off Brookman Road, but they're not all going to come online in the summer of 2022. There's going to be some in 2022, some in 23. And so their 10-year projections show that kind of growth over time. As part of that, they have a kind of, I forget what the exact language is, but a uptake factor. So when we know when they build 100 new homes, we're going to average 96 kids in those homes. That's for single family detached dwellings. For multifamily dwellings, so apartments and townhomes, those kinds of spaces, it's actually about 0.2. So for every 100 apartments, we can expect 20 kids. And so as they're looking at those projections of how many homes are going to be built, they're factoring all of that in to give us a really good idea of what does growth in Sherwood look like. Because it's going to be a little bit different than Wilsonville and a little bit different than Newburgh. And that's the real value of having Davis with us year after year, is they're learning some of these things about Sherwood that will make their estimates more accurate. I will tell you, this pandemic is going to make projections a little difficult when you start looking at years past and moving forward. But that's the reality of this work. It's a little challenging. Then let me talk about the district process. So I would call the Davis process really forward looking, future oriented, maybe is a better way of saying it. Whereas we tend to look towards the past. And so we've developed a process where we look at grade level over the last number of years and see what the average growth between grade levels was. And then we take that number and we apply it to the numbers we have, and we come up with our own projection. And that's done here at the district office by many of the people you see around this table this evening. And then finally, we actually work with our buildings and we talk to each of the principals about what are you seeing in your community? What are you hearing? Because they may hear different things even about developments or homes that are going up for sale. They know when families often are moving or when they hear families are coming in. And some of those are big enough that they'll swing the numbers at any particular school by 6 or 8 kids. And that's an important number to know as we're setting kind of a district-wide enrollment number. And so we take all 3 of those pieces of information, the Davis number, the district number, and then the school number. And that's what we use to actually start the budgeting process for our district. And again, we start this work in December with Davis, and you'll see it as we get to that budget process in April or May. Any questions on that? All right, I'm going to keep on with enrollment. There's some nuances that I think would be really important for all of you to know about. In 2011, the state legislature passed House Bill 2747, and that allows for inter-district transfers. So these are transfers between school districts, between Newburgh and us or Wilsonville and us, those kinds of things. In that process, it has to be non-discriminatory. It starts with the lottery. We cannot be selective. We can't pick the kids that based on race, religion, disability, IEP status, income level, proficiency, or athletic ability. It has to be really just kind of an open process that anybody is qualified for and eligible for. There are some requirements for students when they do transfer to us that we can hold them to. One is attendance, and they have to maintain a 92% attendance rate. And then behavior, and there are some limitations related to suspensions and expulsions that we expect while they're here, they will adhere to as well. So we've used this sparingly as a budgeting tool. You may remember we had a lot of capacity issues prior to the 2016 bond. And so bringing kids from other districts just added to our capacity issues, and it didn't make a lot of sense. We have over the last few years, though, utilized it where we had space, but we always did it selectively because we wanted to avoid what we call the tail. And the tail is how long that student is going to remain in our district. And so we kept it mostly at the high school until just recently we started allowing middle school. Just this year, in fact, middle school students are eligible to transfer to us. And the idea behind the tail is that because the way the state law is written, once we accept that student on an inter-district transfer, they get to stay with us until they choose to go elsewhere or until they graduate. And so if you take a freshman in high school, you have that student for 4 years. If you go down to a 6th grader, starting at middle school, you have that student for 7 years. If you start with a kindergarten and you allow a kindergartner to transfer in, you have 13 years of that student, which is great, except we don't know what our capacity, what our enrollment's going to be in 13 years. And so you always run a little bit of a risk of, if we let in 5 kids today, are we 5 kids over 10 years from now. And we've created a situation where our district has worked very hard to provide the capacity for our students within our community. And now we're over capacity because we're allowing students from outside of it. So again, it's a selective tool that we have used to help with our budget. But we've been very careful as to how we implement that. So we're not creating a situation where we have more kids than we can handle in terms of capacity. Absolutely, please do.
So one of the things that we really struggled with several years ago, I don't even remember the year, Sue, you might recall, but one of the problems when we were so overcrowded was, what do we do with the charter school students that are here, that have become part of the Sherwood community but may not reside in the district? So one of the most challenging votes that we ever took, and it was just heartbreaking and awful, was to have to say, if you're not a Sherwood resident and you've closed out the charter school in 8th grade, we couldn't at that time guarantee enrollment in the high school. And it was awful. And I'm really so grateful that we are back to a space where we can prioritize charter school students and they can come to the high school, and that's no longer an issue. But I think that was one of the things that both this law and the weirdness of this law and how we used to be able to determine whether there would be a good fit or not, and how this law kind of created some challenges in addition to just that overcrowding that we now thankfully don't have that same problem. I think that's one of the things that just from a history standpoint was really one of the hardest things I think this board had to do, was to say no to the charter school. And so grateful we're past that.
Thank you. I appreciate that history. One last thing about the inter-district process is this is a board level decision that we bring to you each spring, at which time we will ask you to open up slots at particular grades, or we may ask you not to. It'll depend on kind of how we utilize that process for budgeting purposes if we need to. So speaking of the charter school, it's okay. It's very different. So this is another impact to our enrollment and revenue, and that's the Sherwood Charter School. It's a district-sponsored charter allowed under Oregon law. Charter schools operate as semi-autonomous schools. It is its own legal entity, has its own board, has its own principal, their own curriculum. It is required to follow some of the state education laws, but is also released from some of the others. They are funded on a pass-through from the district. They get 80% of the ADMW that's attributed to the number of students they have. They can have, based on the charter agreement we have with them, up to 225 students. This past year, I think they were right about 200 and received 1.3 million from the district in the revenue. The district has also chosen to share the ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 grant monies. We'll talk about those in a few slides, but we've done that on a proportional basis with Sherwood Charter. The district provides at our expense services from our student services program to the charter. And as a side note, we also do that for Horizon Christian High School, St. Francis, and Victory Academy. So the private schools within our community get our services from Dr. Fritz and his team. Let's talk about our current enrollment. So our current enrollment for 2021, the enrollment for last year, 2020-2021, was 4,627. So that becomes our ADME, the ADM extended for us. So that becomes kind of the floor for our funding moving forward. We budgeted last spring. As I mentioned, we started that process really prior to the pandemic. I guess no, this was during the pandemic. Last spring, we budgeted 4,859 students. And our current enrollment is 4,728. So we are currently short of what we had expected. We'll continue to watch those numbers as we move forward, but we're also watching statewide because, as we kind of previously discussed, if there are fewer kids across the state, because lots of districts have had students choose other options, then the amount of money we get per student goes up. And so that decrease between the number we have and the number we budgeted for becomes less of an issue. So we have to watch as this shakes out. The date that's so important to all of us for enrollment is October 1, coming up on Friday. And that's the snapshot that the state starts with as they build out how many students we have across the state. Now, we always talk about October 1, October 1. The reality is October 1 is the date they take the shot of the students, and then October 30th is the date we actually have to turn all that data in. And so we won't actually know kind of our official state number until sometime after October 30th. And also, the last thing I'd say is for that current enrollment of the 4,728, that's all of our students that are either in person or on ORVED. So those are the number of kids that are registered with us.
So Jim, I have a quick question. So how long after that end of October date where we turn everything in, do we get an idea of what we're actually going to get per student based on, obviously it depends on what happens with the state and everybody else's enrollment. How long does that take, or when would you expect that data to come back?
If I may, I'm going to have Phil Johansson answer that question for us. Phil, if you'd, yeah, thank you.
I sat in on an ODEOS, Oregon School Board or Oregon Business Officers Association meeting last Friday, and the representative from ODE indicated that they would be rebalancing the state school fund numbers in November. So I'm expecting we'll see something in November.
Great, thank you.
Just as a point of clarity, in case you haven't met Mr. Johansson, he is our Director of Finance, Phil Johansson. Thanks, Phil.
I'll just change direction a little and discuss grants. We get lots of grants, but I wanted to bring your attention to a few of those that are larger or kind of more critical. Starting with the Student Investment Account, which is part of the Student Success Act. And this is funded by the corporate activity tax that we all voted to, maybe we didn't all vote to support, but that was the majority voted to support a few years back. And it's really for two stated purposes. One is to meet students' mental or behavioral health needs, and two is to increase academic achievement for students, including focusing on academic disparities. Now, there's 4 allowable uses, and those include expanded instructional time, to address the student health and safety, to reduce class sizes and caseloads, and then finally to provide a well-rounded education. Measure 98, which is another one of those grants that was funded by, or excuse me, created through a measure that the state voted on, has 3 areas that it addresses. One is dropout prevention. The second is career and technical education, and then finally college level education opportunities. ESSER, which is federal dollars, there's 3 of those grants. And those were grants created by the federal government to help with the cost of COVID and the impact it's had on us and continues to have on K-12. And so those are funds that we have utilized for really COVID related costs. We can buy masks, we can add staff if we have to, those kinds of things. I will say, just so we're very clear, ESSER 1, 2, and 3 are all spread across Oregon based on Title I funding, which I'll get to Title I in the next slide. But because of that, we don't get the same proportion as some of our peer districts. Because of the demographics of Sherwood, we receive far less than even our peers over the hill in Newburgh or in Woodburn. And so when you hear of other districts that are using ESSER dollars to add teachers, to provide wages that are more competitive, some of those kinds of things, we just don't have the same ESSER revenue that they do, and it kind of gives them options it has not given us.
Can I share my gripe about Measure 98?
Sure.
So one of the things that we're all really proud of about Sherwood is that we have continued to, we maintained, even when times got really lean, pre-Measure 98, our investment in career and technical education. And that is a decision we were really proud to prioritize every year and really make sure that we kept those programs intact. When Measure 98 passed, one of its components is it's got a maintenance of effort, or what we call MOE requirements. And that means that you cannot use funds from Measure 98 to backfill programs that were already in place. So if you are a district that let go of shop programs or let go of other career supporting programs, you could use Measure 98 dollars to restore those. But for Sherwood, it became a bit of it meant that we had to go find something new because we were already funding those programs. In order to get the funds, we had to show what new investments we were making. That's very unfortunate from a public policy standpoint because it means that districts that continue to do the right thing were disadvantaged in being able to use those funds. We don't ever consider it a negative that we maintain those programs. And if we had it to do all over again, we wouldn't make any decision that was different than that. But, or at least I wouldn't, and for this board member, I wouldn't make a different decision. But this is the kind of public policy that has unintended consequences because it doesn't allow for deeper and richer investment per se in the kinds of programs that were intended. It requires us to get a little more creative with those investments because we had maintained those over time. So there's my gripe that I've shared many times, but there's new people. So it's like I get to do it all over again.
Thank you, Director Adamson.
I know you love this when I do it. So there you go.
Other key grants include our Title I, Title II, and Title III. So these are federal funds that are given to districts and schools with high percentage of students navigating poverty. This is Title I, to help ensure that all children can meet the challenging academic standards that we've set. And again, this is Title I is the basis for how ESSER dollars were distributed. And since we don't have the same levels of poverty that maybe some of the districts around us do, that's why we get a proportionally less amount of ESSER dollars. For Title II, these are federal funds to increase student academic achievement by improving instruction. So a lot of professional development for our staff. And then Title III is federal funds to assist our English learners as they develop English language skills so they can succeed academically and overcome the barriers that exist before them as it relates to academic success. Now let's talk about the bond, one of my favorite topics. So these are the 7 areas of focus for the 2016 bond. Again, this was a community passed bond that created general obligation for the district. And so the money we took basically in loan gets paid back over a 30-year time frame through collected taxes. The areas of focus included deferred maintenance. And deferred maintenance are items that we may have chosen not to do on our buildings to allow us to do other things. And so one of the other things this board has traditionally done is worked very hard to put money in the classrooms when needed. And because of that, there were times we chose to not do certain things related to the maintenance of our building. The bond gave us an opportunity to get back on track with a lot of that. And we were able to do roofing and other like heating and ventilation upgrades, those kinds of things that we'd put off. And the bond, again, came at a great time for us, and we did a lot of good things with the deferred maintenance money. We are also able to make seismic improvements. So these are improvements made to the buildings to make them more resilient in the event of an earthquake. A lot of it was connecting building rooftops to walls, putting in X-bracing, so that way the buildings just have a better resiliency to the movement. We also spent some resources on safety and security. Our security system being badge access, video cameras, those kinds of things, as well as our radios, GPS systems for the bus system. Obviously, the new high school is a big part of that 2016 capital bond, and it was the addition of space for 2,000 students. And then we had our transformation projects at Sherwood Middle School, the Ridges, Hawksview, and here at this building. And those were all updates that were needed as we changed the purpose of the building. So the former high school becoming a middle school, there were changes we needed to make there. Obviously, there were changes turning this building from a school into an office space. And so the transformation projects worked on that. The two that are not construction related are our technology portion, and that was putting together a one-to-one computer device per student across the district. And that program really helped us as the pandemic came on because we were able to provide a device to every student. Some of my friends who are still IT folk at other districts didn't have that ability because they weren't at a one-to-one ratio. And then curriculum is another area that we were able to support with a capital improvement bond. And we have a process, as you probably know, where we have to update our curriculum based on a schedule from the Department of Ed, and our bond gave us the opportunity to do that. Those last two sections are 10-year projects. We basically finished all the, we have finished all the construction, excuse me. And so that work is done, but our technology and curriculum was designed to be a 10-year system of support for the district. And so we will continue to expend dollars over the next 6 years, roughly 5 years on those two areas. A couple things that the bond cannot pay for. One is staff and the other is supplies. So we are not able to use bond funds to add to our number of teachers, for instance. And then the last piece, let's talk about transportation. The state funds our our bus system at 70%. And so regardless of the district, they pay that much. And that includes the bus, it includes the maintenance on the bus, it includes the driver, and it's for home to school and school to home trips, as well as field trips. It does not include athletics or activities. And this is really the driver of the walk zone conversation we often have. The state says that for elementary students, if they live outside of a mile, you can transport them and get reimbursed. If they live at the middle school and high school, it's 1.5 miles. And so that's often the conversation we have to have is, where do those walk zones start and end? And it's driven by this portion of kind of the state law, and it's that 70% reimbursement. And with that, we're at discussion. I'd be happy to take comments or answer any questions.
Questions, comments?
I don't really have a question for you, but I honestly thought the presentation was very clear and easy to understand, and I really appreciate you doing that. I don't have any questions for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for laying that out. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I guess, Jim, I have one comment or one thing maybe that you could explore a little bit. And we talked about students being brought in and the interdistrict transfers, but if you could just talk a little bit maybe to the fact that we also let students leave Sherwood. So there's some potential to lose revenue or dollars ADM that way.
We do, and we've had a variety of reasons behind why a student might want to transfer out. It might be that they have moved here, they still want to attend their last 2 years at a different high school. There's a variety of reasons, and we have typically let that happen. The board has, I think, given us in the past some direction that we want to accommodate that to the greatest extent we can. And so it's a balancing act between those that are coming in and those that are leaving. And it's something we continue to look at.
And just to be clear, if we have to allow slots for that as well in general for that. So slots in and slots out. So it's not just, it used to be, you know, if districts just work together, they could say, okay, yes, you can take this student and we'll let them leave. But now we have to be official and have slots in and out. So
There are times usually in the spring that we adjust that number to be appropriate so that students are taken care of.
Thank you. That was a much better explanation. But it's also, we have to allow the slots. It's a decision that all of you make. So I had another thought there and I've lost it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's painful. Yeah, I think that just the importance of Davis demographics and the work that they do. And I think prior to that, during my term of board service, we relied on PSU to produce a report. And then we would set a percent of accuracy relative to that report and then use that number because the numbers were wildly off. And I think one of the hardest things about being a board member is knowing that no matter what report you get, that report is off. And so I think we look at it in terms of trends, but that Davis demographics and that relationship we're building and the accuracy that they're getting to is really very helpful, pandemic notwithstanding. But I think one of the things that has just been such an improvement for our district is being able to have that really strong data foundation so that we can make decisions that are more than ping ponging year by year or that we're surprised, but really are planful.
Particularly with that enrollment piece, while growth is always good, a lot of growth is as hard to deal with in some respects as a decline and a small decline in students. And so having that good, accurate data and getting as close as we can and having some organization like Davis Demographics assist us is really important. I recalled my other thought for you, Director Hecker. My other point was on the inter-district transfers. It does require the approval of both districts. So we could say, yes, we'll absolutely let you come to Sherwood, but the district that would be sending that student may say, no, we can't do that at this time. And unfortunately, then we wouldn't be able to admit that student. And that does go both ways. So if we're allowing this, if a student wants to leave, the other district has to be willing to accept them and we have to be willing to let them go.
One thing while we're talking about enrollment, I want to give a shout out to our partners at the city because they've been really thoughtful, including us in the last several years on discussions about bringing residential spots in and making sure that the schools can accommodate those students. And it just makes so much sense to be able to work with them and have a seat at the table to be planful about, like you said, the measured growth, not a surprise on with either party. So just really thankful for the city council and the city of Sherwood in that respect, because they don't have to do that. They don't have to operate that way, but it certainly makes sense for our community to do so. So thank you to them.
I want to add to that, Sue, that while property taxes in general for our operations are, it just makes the bucket bigger for everybody, but doesn't necessarily directly come to us when we add business. Where it does make a big difference is in our capital bond and the pay down rate of that, because all of the dollars that we collect locally stay locally, and we can get ahead of the repayment schedule and keep the rates lower with that kind of growth. And so it is very helpful to us to have city partners that are actively recruiting a wide range of businesses and trying to diversify the property tax base. All of that's really important, and we're grateful for that partnership.
Any other comments, questions, discussion?
I'm just curious. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about. There's a departing district and an incoming district, and they both have to agree. I'm just curious if we've ever had a situation where a departing district didn't want to let go of a student, and what the reasons were or what the reasons might be.
We have had that situation. I don't know kind of officially what the reason was, but often it comes down to economics. And every student that you have leave, their ADM goes with them. And that becomes challenging if you have lots of students trying to leave your district. So I think it's often financial.
And along, to that question, one of the things, and Mr. Rose talked about it, this board has consistently and historically approved those families, those students who wanted to exit Sherwood for whatever reason to go elsewhere. And it just says a lot about our board, who really takes into account that, that family that is making that decision based on what their needs are. And our board has consistently decided, we're not going to say no to that. Even though it means a hit to enrollment, which is something that we're really proud of.
Just one last thing, I think, as we talk about, kind of what happens with the budget in the legislative session, it's because I'm a super nerd on this. I want to clarify that this is about the kind of the long session in the odd years. So like 2021 was a year where they do the budget. There'll be another legislative session in February, but they won't tinker a lot with the budget. They'll do some. But the K-12 budget, the big money on which we can rely, is allocated and largely decided in that long set legislative session, usually with a number that kind of comes out around March, but of the real final budget numbers decided in late May, early June. And so in odd years when we're setting our budget, it's a little more of a game of kind of watching what's happening, really listening to OSBA and others tell us kind of what they're seeing on the ground, what's likely to happen so that we can make a conservative decision about how much money will be available so we don't have to make cuts later. But that then we can usually rely on that number for a 2-year period of time because there's not a lot of shift in that even year session, which lasts only about 35 days. And if they're making adjustments, they're usually adding. If they're making big cuts, then that doesn't feel good for anybody. But just from a context standpoint, this isn't an every year thing. It's a kind of every other year that we really watch for that number.
And this kind of gets into our budget cycle piece that we'll talk more about again in the spring, but I think it's worth noting here, thanks to Director Adamson. But so the state passes a budget on a 2-year cycle, biennium, and we pass one on an annual cycle. And so the other thing the state does is they divide the money across those 2 years, but not equally. They do for typically, and they've tinkered with this over the years, depending on the revenue they had to utilize. But typically they give us 49% in the first year and 51% in the second year. And so that way we have that little bit of bump in the second year of the biennium because they're not coming back into session to change that number. And so they divide, ODE actually does that division based on those 2 years. Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Mr. Rose. It was excellent. Good refresher, and I learned a lot of new things actually. So if it works for everyone, if we could just take a 5-minute recess, just a little break to regroup, we'll come back with board norms. So Christine, if you could do that for us, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, everyone, and welcome back to our work session. So again, just a reminder at the work session, it's just a time where, we're able to discuss things as kind of the team of 10 or as the board. So the next thing on our agenda this evening is to talk about board operating agreements or board norms. So the board of directors is the policymaking body for the school district, and to effectively meet the district's challenges, the school board, superintendent, and the executive team, or what we've referred to as the team of 10, really must function together as a leadership team. So to ensure that accord among team members, it's important to have effective group agreements. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're just putting those in place. So this evening, our board is going to discuss the board norms or agreements. It's noteworthy to note that these agreements are really in addition to literally hundreds of pages we already have in board policy. So there's some redundancy. There's some things that are, duplicitous for sure and are covered in board policy. So we don't have to go too deep in the woods or in the weeds on this. But prior to this evening, the board was engaged in a work session, I think back in August. And at that time, we were able to be together and characterize some of the things that we all see as a high functioning team. Those characteristics developed by the team of 10 include things like trust, accountability, common goals, camaraderie, respect, discipline, healthy communication, use of honest, verifiable facts and information, transparency, and assumption of good intentions. So in addition to developing that list of effective things to work on, the group was also able to share and affirm a list of approximately 13 potential norms or agreements that were important to the group as a whole. In addition to that, I've provided the group with numerous other examples of potential board norms from other districts or from OSBA, that type of thing. But in general, it's important to note that the board norms are really standard. Sometimes they seem kind of obvious. However, it's important to us that we just clarify our intentions and really have a commitment to one another as we work together on behalf of the district. So what we want to do tonight is just discuss some of these norms and just know that these will go up for approval at the next board meeting. So with that, I will share some of the norms that we really talked about back in August. And again, I apologize if this seems a little duplicitous, but some of the items. So the first one was to respect the scheduled starting and ending times for meetings. Obviously, things come up, and so that's understandable, but that would be our goal. To attend regularly scheduled board meetings unless prevented by sickness or unavoidable cause. Again, it seems pretty clear, but we'd just like to add that. Prepare for board meetings by reading materials ahead of the meeting time, communicating questions you have of the superintendent or the executive team, the board chair prior to the day of the meeting whenever possible, simply so that folks can be prepared. The next item we discussed was to always assume good intentions. And it would also be our intent in this next norm to operate in a positive, honest, transparent manner, treating each other with dignity and respect. The next would be to have an openness to new ideas and change, to make sure that we're asking thoughtful questions, to also be cognizant of time demands on staff when making a request. The next would be to consider impact of actions and decisions on kids and staff. The next norm is to debate respectfully and unite behind a decision, which then drives administrative action. The next norm is to listen to experienced educators' expertise and trust the professionals, followed by no surprises on other board members or the superintendent. And what we mean by that is surprises to the board or superintendent would be an exception, not the rule. The ask is that the board chair or superintendent would agree to place an item on the agenda given the appropriate notice rather than bringing it up unexpectedly. And board policy covers this process as well.
Lastly, on this top list would be to communicate in a polite and respectful manner, even though disagreements may occur. Discussions between board members will serve as a model for positive and constructive public dialogue. So with that, those are the top things that came out of that work session, like I mentioned in the summer. There are, and those were agreed upon by the group as a whole. Other, gosh, I think there was another 30 potential things that we had varying thoughts on, but we're not necessarily all. Some were a little bit repeating, and others just didn't have as many folks that felt strongly to put those on as norms. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask the group, do they have any norms that they feel really strongly about that were not included in that? Any thoughts on norms? Does everyone feel confident with the 13 that I've read so painfully aloud? Jessica?
I appreciate you reading them aloud, and I didn't think they were painful at all. I think it's really helpful for us to have norms that we've all agreed to, and so that we can operate with each other from a shared place of agreement about how we're going to proceed. And I like these initial 13 because they're the ones that we all worked on together and collaborated together in developing. And I'm so pleased to see that all of us have signed off on those. And so I think this is great, and I feel really, really good about moving forward.
Anybody else? So with that, what I would propose, obviously, we're not making decisions at this point. What I would like to do is take these norms that we've all thought were important to the group, and maybe clean up a little language if appropriate. I noticed some misspellings on here, but clean up some language so that it's available for our consent agenda for the next meeting. Does that work for everyone? Okay. Well, that was quick. Any comments from the rest of the team of 10? No. Okay. So with that, we're going to go ahead and adjourn. Our next meeting will be October 13th, and that will be our regular school board meeting. Thank you.